Hello and welcome to another episode of the Artistry of Code podcast. Your hosts for today are Grzegorz Godlewski.
Marek Iwanowicz.
And Artur Wolny.
So today we wanted to talk about, or actually continue our conversation about the test pyramid. In the episode 15, we've talked about the end-to-end testing. And for today, we plan to focus on integration testing specifically. So without further ado, let's start. Welcome to the Artistry of Code podcast, where we, together with our guests, are seeking ways of doing things right and having fun with it.
Software, architecture, soft skills, teamwork, and other crazy buzzwords.
Are you ready? Let's bring more value to the business.
To get things rolling, let's start with the first question. What are the integration tests? And Artur, may you start?
Yeah, of course. So for my integration tests are those kind of tests that are about to check how our code, our service actually, so a part of our service is communicating with third-party services. So with those that we don't have like direct control over with. So it includes databases, it includes other services with exposed APIs. It includes also sometimes other part of services, for example, libraries that we use, but we don't have like direct control over it, and we can't test it using unit tests or other kind of tests. So with those that we do not trust 100%.
When it comes to me, the integration testing and the way I define integration testing comes from defining really components or how do we understand components. So when thinking about unit testing, I'm thinking about tests which are like close within a certain component. And for integration testing, I'm rather looking at this from the angle that I'm having multiple components. This might be mine or third party as Artur in your example. And then I'm trying to verify in the tests how those components collaborate and if they collaborate in a way which I planned them to collaborate, right? So it's not necessarily about having something like an off-the-shelf. Sometimes our applications are built from different components, and then we're checking in those tests how those components interact and whether the flows are just right. And how about you, Marek?
So to me, integration tests are often the tests which are crossing the boundaries of a single file or a single folder where I store a single module, single unit of my application. And when they are talking to the different parts of even the same code base, because this way I can ensure that this given module is still okay, while the interaction with the other modules are also okay. But also the important thing to me is that misunderstanding of the integration tests and unit tests in the NodeJS community, which we, I believe, keep struggling for years now, and which came from the Mongoose way of dealing with the database. And the fact that as community, we accepted the state when we are running the database in our unit tests, because it's super simple to get them in-memory Mongo running with Jest. So let's do all the testing with the database running. And I believe it keeps hitting us as Node.js developers for a pretty long time. And fortunately, I can see that in the industry, people are like awaking and we are all awaking and seeing that, yeah, let's start using proper repository pattern and keep the database code in the single place, test the repository with the integration test with the real database running, or in memory, it's up to you, and then call it really integration tests and keep unit tests really unit tests, not some blend between the unit and the integration test.
Yeah, you've touched something which is quite inherent in many languages, really, and this is the libraries. And sometimes when we're writing code, and Mongoose is just one example of it, it pretty much utilizes the active record pattern, but in the recent years, it's also being called an anti-pattern, the active record, because it pollutes that business entity with the database logic. And this is the place where you already start from not from the clean base of the test parameter with the unit test, because you already have to go to the slower types of the tests just to really move forward. And Mongoose is not making this easy for you to get away from this behavior, although, as you explained, that's definitely possible.
Yeah, I definitely agree. But this is the trap, which is so easy to get into it. So to like to mix the business entity with the database entity, but it's still doable with Mongoose to like keep the database entity separate and the business entity separate. And also, it's I think good place to mention that it's also like really good to keep the DTOs, which are then coming out from the domain layer, also separate, so you don't mix everything with everything else.
In the episode about end-to-end tests, we also mentioned something very important, which is no mocking in those tests. And for integration testing, I rather try to keep the same pattern here. So you guys mentioned the in-memory implementation, which is quite nice. But when we do the integration testing, in my opinion, we should always keep the real service on the second side of our test. Yeah, so we need to isolate the code that is responsible only for this collaboration part and test it with the real thing, not with a mock. Because when we have a mock, it's always difficult to ensure that it behaves totally the same as we expect. So this is something I would also add to this definition.
So then the question we have next is, why do we even need integration tests? Do you guys have an opinion on this? I have mine. So when it comes to my opinion, the integration tests are there to give us more assurance and a different perspective on our application, on our code, to verify a couple of things. So coming back to that, picture of having a component. So if there's a component having some clear boundaries, if you're coming from the DDD world, for an example, you're going to have like a bounded context. You might have like a service built around that that's going to give you a component, which is going to focus on those business capabilities. And then you could do all kind of unit testing inside, which are going to verify if the logic within that bounded context is really going to be implemented in the right way. But then again, the interaction between those bounded contexts, between those components, is a different type of a story. There might be different problems there. Specifically, if you have some mapping between those domains. So if you, let's say you have like an classical accounting service and then some sort of like a payroll service, these are having different parts of the domain within them. And if you would like to check if the mapping between those subdomains is working fine, this is the place where the integration tests really shine, right? So it's not really about the technical integration test, whether things are integrated technically correctly, but rather whether the domain objects transfers are working in an appropriate manner.
From my perspective, we need integration tests actually all the time, because it's a very rare use case that we don't need any third-party service, that we don't need any database. So for me, those tests are the most crucial, because like I said before, this is the part of the system that we don't have like full control over it. Yeah, sometimes we are hosting databases or other services on our side, so it might look easier, but it's always a collaboration with some external party, with something that is not visible at a first glance, that we cannot test with unit tests to check every change against it. And sometimes, especially when we are using database in the SaaS manner, sometimes we don't even have like 100% control over the versioning there. Yeah, sometimes there are updates that we don't have full control, or they can surprise us. So integration tests can then jump in, and either with your changes or with external changes, you will always know that your app is still running as it expected, and it is doing what you want. Because in my opinion, when we are testing the database, we should make an expectation on the final state in that database, not on the order of operation that has been applied. So we shouldn't look at the details. So it is important to have them, because in the real world right now, we're always using some third-party services. And what about you, Marek?
To me, when it comes to try to answer the why part, first part is that when we are doing unit tests, we are always setting up the mock. That's usually the part of given part of the unit test, and that's one critical why to me is that when we are, as you Arthur said, that we are always using some external parts of either our code base in some way or the external services. We don't set up them, they are behaving as they want. So to get rid of this part of setting up the mock and setting up our expectations how they should behave, lets them behave as they really want and as they will behave in reality. So that's one thing, and the second part is that I really want to give like support to this part of testing with things which we don't have like full control of, because it's like super critical. And I would like to like look on the side of the database a bit differently, because when I was working with, for example, Mongo Atlas in this case, they are giving possibility to update. They don't force you to update in any way, at least while you are not using like super legacy version. And thanks to like having the integration tests, the real integration tests, we were able to validate that we can update our service to the newer version, and we won't have the issue there because we had proper integration tests, which is the purpose of having them. So that's why we need them.
Marek, you actually get it right. That's precisely what I wanted to say in my sentence. So thanks for clarification.
Always here to help.
And I really like that point, Arthur, because it just occurs to me that having that type of testing, so if that's a database component, but that might be a cache component, a different API, we are actually having a small regression suite available this way. So if there are going to be some backward compatibility breaking changes introduced between versions, this is something very useful and ensuring, because from my past, I do recall a lot of fear coming from, updates or fear for updates of components. Companies weren't sure if everything is going to work fine, if they're going to upgrade the component to version 7 from version 6. And they were stuck on the version 6 for like 5 years or more, just because of that fear and not having any proof that the system is going to work. And and I believe our listeners did experience this at least once, that it is very hard to retroactively build up integration tests or get the buy-in from the business. So this way, actually, that's committing more to the tech debt, right? Because if you don't have a tool or an argument that, okay, we're going to be safe, we're going to just deploy it, run tests. If everything is going to come out fine out of those tests, we're fine to migrate. Otherwise, that might be a struggle lasting a couple of years in some companies, really. So let's try to dive into some pro tips, perhaps, because the integration tests are located in the middle of the test pyramid. So we wanted to talk about our preferences now. For instance, when do we favor integration tests over end-to-end tests, for an instance? So Arthur.
Yeah, I might say that I always prefer integration tests over end-to-end test, but only if we bound it to the context of testing the actual integration. So if we have like a business use case that can be fulfilled with writing to some external service database, etc. Then those edge cases of this business case, in my opinion, should, and I always implement it this way, lands up in the integration testing. Yeah, so we have like a basic operation on entity when we're playing with DDD, for example, and those different operations are then tested by integration tests, while the end-to-end tests are left for those big business cases with edge cases of the business case. So I don't need that many end-to-end test cases to cover all the operations that the service can do with another collaborator service. So we gain this way some time, because integration tests are still less performance, require less performance than end-to-end test. And it's also what I try to do every time is using the repository pattern with this single responsibility rule. So then we have some kind of interface for a repository, and on some level of end-to-end cases, I can even make them faster by replacing the implementation with some kind of in-memory implementation. So which is what you, Marek, don't like in the unit test. I very do like it in end-to-end tests, which are running, for example, in the CI pipeline. And I can do it, like replace it with in-memory implementation, because I have a full suite of integration testing checking my other database, which needs the network connection, and this takes more time. So this is what I try to practice every time.
To me, I prefer having integration over end-to-end, or I would twist it a bit over. So I really want to have integration aside of end-to-end tests, because it really helps to trace down the issue, to narrow the part of the code which can have the issue when the end-to-end tests are starting to fail. Because what I've found from my experience with end-to-end tests, when they are getting read, it's like super hard to find the real root cause of the failure. Sometimes, it ends up after like hours of investigating that it's like wrong assumption or wrong setup of the end-to-end test itself, because we have all the tooling around end-to-end tests. But how can you know that it's there when you don't have like full assurance that the other levels are okay? So that's one really critical part to me. So it really saves the time, and it really helps with keeping the development pace high enough, let's say, and not like spending hours on pointless investigation, which would be solved immediately when we would have an integration test there.
Yeah, I like what you said. I want to add that if you have like a good piece of integration test coverage, sometimes you don't even land up in a situation when end-to-end tests are failing because of the collaboration issues between your service and other services. So it's another point that you have like a shorter feedback loop from your continuous integration.
Yeah, that's so true. Especially if you have like the CI setup in a fail fast way. So either the end-to-end test will be cancelled, or they won't even restart with the integration tests failing. And one thing to add on top of this is that it really shines when you have like big code base and people working full stack. So when your PR is like creating or something or modifying something on multiple layers, it's super helpful to like give you assurance that your change is okay on every level.
I just like to quickly add something which I discovered just a couple of days ago, I would say. I'm not sure if you guys know about that, but Jest has a flag. I believe the name is like bailout. or stuff like that, which cancels testing after a defined number of tests already failed. So if you have a set of hundreds of thousands of tests, you can fail the whole build after 10 of them failing without waiting for the end. So that's about, commenting on the or adding to the fail fast setup of the CI. That feedback loop can be even shorter, although lossy in terms of we won't know if the other tests failed. You just know that at least 10 of them failed, but not the rest. So use with care.
I wanted to say that if you need to use it in unit test or integration test, then something is wrong.
That probably shows a different problem somewhere.
Just also has quite few features like which should be flagged to use with care. Yeah. So always be careful.
And about, like my opinion about favoring the integration tests over the end-to-end tests, I'm totally on your side with the feedback loop. So if I'd like to have the information from the CI and even before push to the repository, if somebody's using Git hooks, and I would like to have it fast and frequently, then I will probably go with integration tests over end-to-end tests. For me, also figuring out whether that's an end-to-end or integration test is really a matter of the question which I'm asking in the tests. So when I'm focusing the test, or the test is about to provide me an answer to a question, whether the component A and B are working correctly, that in a sense, that is a question for integration tests. This is not a question for end-to-end testing. If that's a question whether the invoice for that order is generated correctly, like after a shipment is made, that's more of an end-to-end test rather than a pure integration test, right? So let's say that's the level of abstraction again for me. The last question for this episode would be, what are the tools you might use for integration testing? And for me, typically I'm sticking to Jest most of the time because I'm still thinking about integration testing more in context of the component integration. And the component, again, is something that can be defined pretty widely. That might be modules in an application. So then Jest is just fine for me, with some mocking frameworks if that's going to be necessary, or like an in-memory database. This is specifically for Mongoose, I would say, and MongoDB as a dependency. I also recall things like test containers, but I believe Arthur will elaborate on this way much more. Another tool which is very frequently popping up for me is obviously Docker Compose, because we would like to run those dependencies as separate containers so that the application can be tested against those containers. And that's pretty much also the way a couple of those build engines do it. As far as I recall, GitHub allows spinning up some containers for testing really from the GitHub build specification. So you're just adding dependencies as containers. It's starting up those containers for your test. You don't have to deal with that. So that's also a nice tool. Arthur, how about you?
Grzegorz, you hijacked this section because I feel like you you pointed out all good items that I also would put on that list.
It's the drawback of working together. It's like
yeah, we have a similar understanding of this. So yeah, for me, it's also some kind of containerization solution that is about to start these third-party services locally. But of course, it can be also some kind of virtual environment spawned in the cloud. But I must say that it's not very frequent to see this kind of solution. That's true that lots of CI tools are giving their way of specifying dependencies, but I'm not that big fan, because then you have some kind of vendor lock, and all the tests that you are running needs to be rewritten if there is any decision to move on, or we would like to reuse the same test case locally that is on the cloud, which is always a plus to have it running the same, because you don't have to find issues that are coming from little differences in definition of those tests. If it comes to me on the code level, I also use Jest because I feel like integration tests are very similar to the unit tests. Just the location of the collaborator class is a little bit further than in unit tests. So it's maybe an analogy, but describes pretty much how I feel about it. And yeah, that's all I have to say.
Adding to Jest from my side, I also like stick with Jest for the integration tests, but only for the tests itself, let's say. So not for any kind of setup. So I really don't like having anything more than like just few simple lines to solve some strange node specific issues in Jest setup, because if it grows, it will keep growing, and it's I found it's like really risky, especially when the team grows, because people will keep adding their hacks to their Jest setup. So to me, my tooling advice here is like to always keep Jest setup as thin as possible, because it can become really, really hard to deal with in the future.
Okay, I reminded myself that there's one more tip that I would give to everyone who is testing integration, especially when the things are like behaving asynchronously in the background. So I also use the retry mechanism that will try to make an assertion in some timeouts, repeated assertion tries until, I don't know, like 3 tries or until 5 seconds remaining. That is something that can help you with tests being very fragile, especially when you're doing something like sleep 5 seconds, because when you do it, then you don't know, like you assume that 5 seconds is enough to finish the job. On the other side, sometimes 5 seconds of waiting is a waste of time, because the operation has been done in, I don't know, like 200 milliseconds. So it's a huge waste of time. So always do the repeated assertions in your integration tests.
Yeah, I completely support that, and I think this is like really great advice for the integration tests, like to never ever use some sort of sleep or wait, however it is called in your language, I mean programming language, because it can like either slow down or make tests super fragile. So either use some custom assertion which will wrap up the standard synchronous assertions, or just use some library, or I think some languages even provide it out of the box or with the native, like the built-in testing libraries.
I must though admit that you've got me a little bit worried about this retries in those tests. This rings as something which probably again points to a different problem somewhere else, right? So if you have the need of retrying in the test, that pretty much points to some fragility of either the test or the application. So you might want to, like double check if that's really necessary.
Yeah, the retry is only for assertion. So checking if the state that we desire is already applied. It doesn't mean that something is wrong with the test itself. But if you compare the very crowded, let's say, occupied with requests database versus your local database that you only use for your integration test, then the time needed, to apply some changes might differ. And this is only to make those tests more robust, fail proof. That's all.
I think it's especially applies to some weight of distribution in the system. So even if, for example, you have database cluster, let's say, with 3 nodes working, and this way, if your read side will hit other replica which was used for write, you may have failure, even if it's everything okay with the application and test setup. So yeah, I think it especially helps with this kind of issues with some sort of distribution in the system.
Okay, guys, so with having this said, I'm looking at the timer and we're slowly getting to the end of today's episode. So I believe it's time to ask our listeners about their experience with the integration testing. So, guys, if you have something which you'd like to share with us, any pro tips, or perhaps your ideas on how do you divide and conquer the scope of the integration test, how do you split things between end-to-end and integration testing, we would be very happy to learn about this. And that's all for now. So it's time to say bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. That's all for today. Thanks for spending your time with us.
Visit our page on Facebook and Twitter, leave us a comment under the episode, subscribe to the updates, and share it with others.
We would like to hear your feedback so that we can prepare more interesting content for you to enjoy. Hear you next time.